Yeah, maybe if I just start talking, people think something is happening. So thank you for coming back to the third session. The people coming in, do you think you could, just Mona, can you get people to come in now? Just, yeah, grab them, thank you. We're starting a bit early because people have flights to catch later this evening, and so we've moved everything up 10 minutes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I think it will make a difference at the end. And we don't want to eat too much into the breakout groups, which is, I think, where people find the greatest amount of interaction and enjoyment. So, yeah, so I'll just start with a very gentle introduction, and hopefully then people will start running and sitting down. So thank you for coming back to session, to theme 3. My name is Sharon Kaur. I teach at the Faculty of Law at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. I'm a steering committee member, and I'm really, really thankful to have had the opportunity to work with 3 amazing presenters on this topic, and they've really borne with me and my very steep learning curve as well. So, you know, over the last day and a bit, we've talked in fairly general terms about ethical considerations and some of the processes that go into research health prioritization exercises, and primarily we've looked at national exercises, and we're going to continue in the same vein, but what we're going to do in this session is that we're going to focus a little bit more on government, and we're actually going to be thinking a little bit about what are the roles and responsibilities of governments when they go through these exercises. And there are not many countries, especially in LMICs, where governments are under a legal obligation to carry out these exercises. So it's very hard to say, well, these are the legal rules, and this is what governments have done, or this is what governments have failed to do. But I think there's broad agreement that governments have a duty to ensure the well-being and the health of their citizens, and part of that will include setting these health research prioritization categories and moving forward on that for the benefit of their people at a national level. So we're just going to be looking at that, and one of the questions that we're going to ask, the key ethical question is, what are the ethical principles that should guide governments when they're actually doing this? And we recognize that there are 2 main aspects of it. There's the substantive values that should be reflected in these exercises, as well as the actual processes through which these priorities are set. And we're going to look at both of them, but the presenters are actually going to give us a snapshot of different case studies and different aspects where governments have taken up this research prioritization exercise and comment on specific things that have happened. So in our first case study, we're actually going to look at the process of inclusivity and including participants. And we're going to be thinking about what does it mean to have a democratic process? And we're going to look at a really interesting way in which maybe technology has resulted in a decrease in the notion of democratization of the process, and what really is the role of the government in inclusivity, and perhaps even more importantly, in ensuring translation of these priority setting exercises into real change or into real research that benefits the communities. In the second study, we're going to look not just at a single country, but across 3 countries at national research prioritization exercises, and really ask very interesting questions about, if you are setting it, if you are doing this at a national level and you have national agencies that are actually carrying out these activities, what sort of authority or power should you give to these authorities, especially given some of the things that we've been discussing, that they actually have to navigate these very, very difficult waters involving private funders, public funders, involving advocacy groups, and what sort of powers or resources should be given to national bodies when they're actually carrying out these exercises, and what sort of tools should they have at their disposal. And in our final paper, we'll be looking at a case study where the presenter is going to discuss the very, very interesting and important notion of government stewardship, that if you're actually taking a lead and you're guiding these exercises, what role does government have and what does good stewardship mean, or what should it mean? And specifically in relation to something I think we haven't talked about, which is the notion of when you outsource these sort of activities, what duty then might the government have, and how do we think about capacity building within the national setting? Does the, because we've talked a lot about how funders should build capacity, how money should come into LMICs, but what sort of duty do LMIC governments themselves have to ensure that they are building capacity within their structures in order to ensure that these exercises are carried out and carried out well, and that they improve in the future? So without too much of fuss, and I'll stop here because I think it's much more interesting to listen to the speakers, it is my pleasure to invite our first speaker, Gugulethu Khumalo from the KwaZulu-Natal Department of Health in South Africa, who will speak to us about prioritizing health research in KwaZulu-Natal. Gugu, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be talking this morning about prioritizing research, a process that we normally do every 5 years in our province in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. It's not going to the next slide. Okay. Okay. I'm going to be specifically focusing on two ethical aspects of ethics in priority setting. And the first one being inclusiveness of stakeholders, and also if the research that has been prioritized is actually translated into research. Inclusiveness in research prioritization processes actually involves a meaningful representation of a variety of stakeholders, as we have mentioned, especially of the vulnerable and voiceless people. And the second one, which is translation of research, is actually pointing to or asking a question. It's if the research that has been translated, that has been prioritized, is then translated into research. In KwaZulu-Natal, if I can set a background, is the second largest province in South Africa, and we are 11.4 million, and we also an epicenter of HIV and TB, and as such, research is very rich in our province. Most of the researchers flock in our province to conduct research, and we are the third poorest province in South Africa, especially the outskirts or the rural parts of South Africa. A research prioritization process in KZN, it's governed by the National Health Act, which is actually very silent on how to actually do a prioritization of research. It just says that the national and provincial health governments have to conduct this process, but it's very silent on how it can be funded and who should be invited, all those questions. And as such, most provinces in South Africa, they just do research prioritization based on however way they want and depending on what resources they have. As I've said, they just say national and provincial health research committees have just to conduct this process every 5 years. So the first key ethical issue that I'm talking about is the stakeholder engagement, and I'm going to link it into the processes that we've done in our province. The first one being in 2013, and 5 years later in 2018. These two processes were very different. On the methods, the first one in 2013, which was very successful, was actually workshops that were face-to-face. We went to every district in the province and invited as many stakeholders as possible. Whereas in 2018, we did an online survey. And the outcome, we had 1,018 priority questions versus 213 questions or later on the 2018 survey. And the participants in 2013, they were very diverse participants or stakeholders, academia, traditional healers, community leaders, department staff, and so on. Whereas in the survey, there were only 73 participants, and the participants in 2018 were homogeneous, which means they were kind of not diverse, mainly district managers who had access to an online tool or data to be able to access the survey. And then when it comes to translation of research, I'm going to base this on the 2013 research prioritization process, where we then, after the process, we took research that was done after that, and we, as I've said, we had 1,018 research priority questions, and we compared them with the questions that were prioritized then in 2013, the themes kind of. A quantitative analysis, and then we come out with a finding that only 28% of research that was prioritized was actually subsequently conducted, which means that the research that we prioritized was not done in this instance, and which says that it was less optimal. The process that we did, it was like we never did it because it didn't do much. The researchers still chose to do whatever they wanted to do. And then the ethical concern based on the inclusiveness of stakeholders is that in South Africa, we are marked by inequality that still exists. Yes, Mandela came and he's dead now, but the inequality still persists, and the people that are voiceless are still voiceless. I like the word that my sister used, that now it's equity deserving. So the equity deserving are still much marginalized, and they have no voice at all. And what makes it worse is that these are the very same people that are burdened with disease that we really should prioritize. But as we saw with our outcome of results, they are not prioritized. Sorry about that. Okay, and the ethical concern when it comes to stakeholder involvement, we're saying that there is an important ethical issue when it comes to researchers and funders on how they uptake the research priority questions. I don't know if it's our fault as government that we're not mobilizing or marketing these prioritized questions as efficiently as possible. And then there's a question of the government itself. Should it now refuse to grant approval of studies that are not that are not prioritized in the province? And also if funders themselves should actually refuse research that does not meet the priority formula of the province, or does this undermine the potential of blue sky research if they do that? So those are the questions that then came, with our priority question study. And we recommend that government and funders need to collaborate and be adequate with their, or intentional with their meetings and collaboration into making sure that research that is prioritized is then subsequently conducted. The same thing with government funders, researchers, and academic organizations. They have to strengthen their relationship and not to coerce them to do the research that is only prioritized, but to strike a balance as much much as they can do blue sky research, but to also consider studies or research areas that have been prioritized by the government. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gugu. We'll take questions in a plenary session later. So our next speaker is Lydia Kapiriri from McMaster University, Canada, who will speak to us on health research priority setting experiences from Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia.
Thank you very much. I was very ambitious to present 3 case studies. I hope I get you through without running over myself. So one thing that Joe talked about in the plenary yesterday as a governance challenge was the issue of evaluating priority setting. We've had so many cases of priority setting, but very few on how people evaluated their priority setting processes. And this was identified as a need, and hence the case studies that you're going to hear. So the World Health Organization has supported and instituted national health research agencies in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are mandated to set health research priorities. However, many of them have conducted several exercises, but they've never evaluated them. So the theoretical gap is that while there are very many approaches to health research priority setting, there has been limited focus on approaches to evaluating health research priorities. In that even if we are talking about including ethical principles, we don't step back and say, did we do that? So, and then the practical gap was that although many countries, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa had engaged in health research prioritization, they had not systematically evaluated their processes. Evaluation would have been important in them knowing where they are not performing well and designing improvement strategies. So specifically in Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia, they had conducted many, like Uganda had conducted 5 prioritization exercises. Zambia had done the same, but there had been no systematic evaluation and harnessing of lessons. And there is a potential of south-to-south learning from each other, but if there is no standardized way of harnessing those lessons, there is no way of sharing those experiences in a meaningful way. So we conducted case studies in Zambia, Uganda, and Tanzania. We used a qualitative case study methodology. We reviewed documents, so national health research documents, but also health policy documents to assess how they thought about priority setting, who was responsible for priority setting, what are the principles that should guide priority setting in those countries. But we also talked to key informants who had been involved in the prioritization processes to understand what they thought about the prioritization processes. We've talked about stakeholder engagement. We wanted to hear from the people who were involved, whether they thought they were meaningfully involved, whether they thought the stakeholder engagement was meaningful, and whether they thought the criteria they proposed were implemented and the like. So this was guided by a framework that we developed with my colleagues at the Joint Center for Bioethics. And I will not talk a lot about this framework. But what I want to highlight is that this framework supports evaluation of priority setting, whatever approach is used. It emphasizes the relevance of the context of priority setting. It emphasizes the importance of the legitimacy of the organization that's priorities. It emphasizes the importance of a good priority setting process, including a fair process and explicit criteria. It also goes ahead to emphasize the relevance of the output of priority setting. We've talked a lot about, because it's unethical to invest in a prioritization process where the priorities are not implemented, because it's misuse of resources. So we emphasize the impact, and the impact is on equity and also on population health. So very quickly, I'll go through the findings, but I just wanted to emphasize the framework because I think it's an addition to our conversation. All the countries had the same context. With regards to the prerequisites, they all had national health research agencies, which we thought were legitimate to set priorities. However, the capacity varied. Specifically, NIMRI is stronger than the NRHA in Uganda and Zambia. With regards to resources, again, we discovered actually that NIMRI gets resources from their government, which the other countries don't. So there was that learning, and we were saying, okay, maybe the National Health Research Organizations from the other countries should start requesting for more funding. All countries did not have incentives for compliance, and that is a problem, especially where there is a lot of donor funding who come in with their own agendas. If they had incentives or disincentives, maybe that would help. With regards to the process, there was some element of meeting some elements of a fair process, but they did not meet all the 4 conditions of accountability for reasonableness. With regards to stakeholder engagement, it was limited in that most of the stakeholders were drawn from the national level, whereas many of these countries are decentralized, and there was a challenge of harnessing information and research priorities from the district level. Explicit criteria were included and equity was included, but that depended on the framework that was used. There were several exercises, different frameworks were used, so depending on the framework, that was the criteria that were used. To note here that although the National Health Research Agencies had their own criteria, when a donor came in and wanted to set priorities for example, maternal child and neonatal health, they came in with the CHINRI framework, which has its only set of criteria. So those criteria were used, but they are not institutionalized in the National Health Research Agency. With regards to implementation, when our prioritization process was led by a donor, allocation of resources was according to the priorities. But when the National Health Research Agencies set priorities, because they don't have funding to allocate to the priorities, those were not, respected. There was accountability to the extent that they followed a fair process. With regards to outcome and impact, and this relates to my initial conversation about lack of evaluation, there was no systematic evaluation of the impact and outcome of any of the prioritization process, beyond saying how many of the priorities were funded. So they did not say what impact did the research actually have. So overall, there was no assessment of the effectiveness of the success of the health prioritization processes. So some of the challenges generally that we synthesized from all this is that there is fragmentation of priority setting processes. There are competing stakeholders in health research priority setting. So that NHRAs are setting priorities, the universities are setting priorities, the donors are setting priorities, so they are competing stakeholder research priorities. And most of the exercises are expert-driven, and because of the time the experts have to set the priorities, there is limited effort to capacity strengthening within the NRHAs. And there is limited evaluation of health research priority setting, as I said. So in conclusion and recommendations, we think that governments and research donor agencies should strengthen and support national health research agencies if we agree that they are the legitimate bodies that should set priorities with the legal, financial, and technical resources to enable them to deliver on their mandate to set health research priorities. The national health research agencies should identify an approach or a hybrid of approaches, like we saw from Malawi, that with both procedural and substantive criteria that should guide the health research prioritization. And here it's really emphasizing that this process should be driven and owned by the national health research agencies. And also the agencies should be responsible for conducting systematic evaluations of their prioritization process to identify lessons of good practice that could be shared, and also to identify areas of improvement where they can focus their limited resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Joseph Oraño from the Alliance for Improving Health Outcomes in Philippines to deliver his talk on ethical challenges and improvement pathways, a case study on health research priority setting in the Philippines.
Thank you, Sharon. Bonjour. My name is Joseph Oraño, and I'm lucky to represent our team from the Alliance for Improving Health Outcomes. So I'm presenting on behalf of Kim Sales, who's also there in the middle of the room, my colleague, and Dinel Alexiong couldn't make it today. So the title of our case study, as Sharon mentioned, is Ethical Challenges and Improvement Pathways, essentially a case study on governance and health research priority setting in the Philippines. So as a we receive grants from and support government in health research priority setting, but this case study was developed independently from our funders. So to start with a bit of context into who the health research priority setting actors are in the Philippines. In 2013, the Philippine Department of Science and Technology, or the DOST, and the Department of Health collaborated to institutionalize the Philippine National Health Research System. And then under the DOST is the Philippine Council for Health Research and Development, or the PCHRD, which administers the PNHRS and serves as its secretariat. And finally, under the PNHRS is a committee called the Research Agenda Management Committee, or the RAMC, which is tasked to provide guidance on shaping the country's health research agenda and align it with societal goals across various sectors. The PNHRS is rooted in CORED's essential national health research principles and operates on the imperative that the identification of health needs and targeting research towards those needs should lead to increased utilization of evidence in policymaking. And this case study will focus on the latter three ENHR principles of equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. So among the key strategies to ensure this health needs-oriented approach in health research in the Philippines is the National Unified Health Research Agenda, or the NURA. So this is an advocacy document that aims to guide health research activity, generate research support and funding, and promote research translation. It was first developed in 2006, and since then it is being developed and implemented in 6-year iterative cycles, which coincide with the presidential term of office. Our organization is a Philippines-based NGO, which has activities that extend to health policy and systems research, including research on research. And since 2014, we have published several journal articles and other special issues that reflect on our insights and experiences in dealing with the health research system in the country. So what follows, our case study is a distillation of our experiences and observations through our years of work in health policy and systems research. So the first ethical challenge that I'd like to bring you to is how we have weak research agenda stewardship in the country, but it seems that it is an unintended effect of public policy. So as part of Philippine policy, any new long-term DOST-funded research initiative or institution should produce a research agenda before it is allowed to access funds. But what this means for our RPS stakeholders is that at the point when the research agenda is being developed, there is an absence of clear strategic direction, values, and commitment to the research agenda. And stakeholders who participate in our RPS processes are often left in the dark about the scope of work, the capacity and resources available to the research initiative. So ranking research priorities is about making choices, and these choices should be based on a defined scope, values, and context. But what we found is that inadequate RPS stewardship has led to poor decision-making in these value trade-offs, and these may not represent the values of the implementer or the future implementer of the research agenda. Second, we also try to investigate into, the role of contractors in weak research agenda stewardship. So we think that weak research agenda stewardship manifests in and is exacerbated by this continued reliance on outsourcing to contractors. So we believe that there is a chronic underappreciation of RPS, and this is demonstrated by lagging institutional capacity development within the PCHRD, contributing to their reliance on outsourcing of RPS to contractors such as us. And down the line, while this has increased our technical capacity, it has also widened the information gap between contractors and the RAMC, which is supposed to provide guidance on research agenda development in the country. And there are two great examples of how this has contributed to ethical challenges. So firstly, it manifests in the ability of the RAMC to revise newer themes, even though stakeholders have already been consulted. So this risks removal of themes that have already been identified by stakeholders as important in their locality. And then secondly, there's the non-inclusion of implementation and monitoring and evaluation during RPS processes, as advised by the RAMC. So we contend that if a research agenda is seen only as a prerequisite for funding or institutional growth, that its significance within a national health research system would remain undervalued. And this hinders progress towards an effective and efficient national health research system. Continuing on the point of the importance of monitoring and evaluation, in our RPS work through the years, we found that current health research M&E data is not fit for purpose and is of low utility in health research decision-making. And our approach, the bottom-up RPS approach, does require substantial resources. But without a relevant and effective M&E system, assessing the returns on these investments remain uncertain. So for example, there might be neglected research areas or duplication of research efforts, and we just frankly don't have the data to be sure about these. So with a lack of a reliable M&E system, there's a risk of perpetuating inefficiencies in the use of public research funds. And finally, we look into how resource constraints affect equitable health research priority setting. We observe in our line of work that increasing trend of short-termism in health policy and systems research, including RPS contracts. But despite this short-termism, there remains an expectation to adhere to good practices of research priority setting. While we are innovative, for example, we developed online tools to extend our reach during the pandemic, there's still trade-offs in stakeholder engagement. So in our work, we frequently deal with the academe, government agencies, because these are well-structured groups that are ready to join the process at any time. But unfortunately, on the other hand, we have less organized groups, such as civil society in marginalized sectors or equity-deserving sectors, who are much harder to identify and compelled to participate. So these resource constraints, we believe, has limited diversity and participation of these less organized groups in RPS processes, creating missed opportunities to contribute to a more equitable health research agenda in the Philippines. So in summary, weak research agenda stewardship has led to unclear strategic direction and values. So this has resulted in misaligned decisions that may not represent the values of the implementers of the future research agenda. And this creates concerns for an effective and efficient national health research system. We also have ill-defined M&E mechanisms in the country that provide low utility data for health research decision makers, and we believe that these perpetuate inefficiencies. And lastly, resource constraints impact stakeholder engagement, contributing to missed opportunities for a more equitable health research agenda. Our recommendations are fivefold. First, there's a need to strengthen stewardship. Within the PCHRD, our major health research actor, there's a need to capacitate them in health research agenda development and management. We need to integrate all research management activities for the Ramsey in all parts of the research cycle, such that they're not just limited to research priority setting, but we ensure their participation in implementation and monitoring and evaluation. We also need to ensure meaningful participation of all Ramsey members. Secondly, there might be a need to revisit public policy to shift the mindset on the purpose of a research agenda, that information on available capacity and funding should inform research agenda development and not the other way around. Thirdly, we need to prioritize capacity development. We need to steer away from outsourcing RPS to contractors towards knowledge and skills acquisition from contractors such as us to improve internal expertise within the government and resources for research agenda development. Fourth, we could benefit from extending RPS timelines that allow for diverse stakeholder engagement and thoughtful decision-making. And lastly, we need to value M&E as an integral part of the research process. And as a starting point, we might be able to identify minimum viable M&E indicators that are workable or feasible in the Philippine setting and clarify stakeholder roles in M&E in the PNHRS. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Can I invite Lydia and Gugu to come and join Joseph on stage for the question session? So we'll just let Lydia and Gugu make their way up. Does anybody have any questions? Do we have one here?
Thank you so much for great talks. I'm Ehsan Shamsi Gushki, Monash University and Tehran University of Medical Sciences. I have two questions. The first, my first question is from Lydia about, the role of national authorities in, it's important to integrate external fundings, international funds into their national priority setting system. So to avoid issues such as undue inducement or imposing some priorities to the national research area without having social value for that community. In your evaluation of those systems, have you found any kind of efforts for such integration of external funds into a national priority setting system? And can I ask my second question?
Yes, please.
My second question goes to Joseph about, I think that discussions around the governance of priority settings are more shifted toward integration and participation and inclusion, while other issues such as accountability and evidence-based priority setting as other pillars of good governance are less discussed here. And the priority setting itself should be prioritized as an organized activity. What do you think about, do you think, is there a real imbalance in our discussions, or what you found in your evaluation regarding accountability and evidence-based priority setting? Thank you.
Yeah, I think you just start speaking and the mic will pick it up.
Oh, okay. We have to have faith. Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's something that has plagued, and I mean, it has dominated most of our conversations here. the role of donor agencies in national health research prioritization, especially in low-income countries. I know in the countries where we conducted the case studies, there are efforts to involve donor agencies in the prioritization processes. That has not been so successful, but there are efforts to engage them in the prioritization processes. Because I think when we think about engagement, we know the values of engagement, but when we get to the national level, we think donors should not be engaged, but we should just give them a list. I think that is unfair. If we want them to buy into the priorities, they should be also stakeholders in the prioritization process. And their efforts, after we evaluated, I think many countries were thinking and saying we should get them in to be involved in the process so that we don't just get back to them with a prioritization list. However, I know that Rwanda, and I stand to be corrected if there is someone here from Rwanda, I've heard a lot about Rwanda's success story in that they came up with a list which they stuck to, and actually donors bought into that list. So I think it's possible if the donors know the credibility of the process. So I would just add this one small thing, that I talked to donor agencies with these case studies. I interviewed different international agencies that fund global health research, and I was asking them the same questions. How do you set your priorities? And my other interest was asking them specifically, why don't you honor the priorities that are set by the national health research agencies? And repeatedly what I heard was that the capacity in those agencies is not strong enough, so the priorities are not credible. So my question is, why don't you strengthen the capacity so that you build the credibility of the process? So I think if we think about it from the two perspectives, so if the donors are to support national research agencies to build the capacity, and then the national health research agencies are also participatory, they engage the donors in the prioritization processes, then I think the donors would trust the national health research agencies to manage their funds. Otherwise, I don't think it will happen. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think the question on accountability of the governance structures in the Philippines in research priority setting, I think I touched a bit on how we do lack M&E mechanisms in the Philippines, and to hold these organizational structures accountable, we do need data. So that's half of the problem. But we also want to ask in these questions about accountability, what frame do we apply? What framework do we apply? When we look at the legal imperatives behind health research priority setting in the Philippines, it's really to address health needs and to align with different goals of economic sector, societal sector, political sector. And again, these questions are difficult to answer without a reliable monitoring and evaluation mechanism. I mean, at best, we can say in the processes that we apply in the Philippines that we're able to represent the research interests of a broad swath of Filipinos. But when it comes down to brass tacks, we don't have the data to hold our structures accountable. Well, we have data, but they're of limited use.
Okay, thank you. Mona has a question. Oh, there's so many. Right.
I have a
maybe
question
one more.
I have a question for everyone. It's really sounds a bizarre question, but do you think the priority setting was actually useful in those countries? I'm saying it because sometimes priority setting doesn't end up anywhere, but sometimes the usefulness might be something else, getting people together, even if the priority doesn't work. So I want to see, do you think it was actually useful and made a change?
I think when government sets priorities, the problem is the standard goal. When you don't have a standard goal, I think this is a recipe for disaster, actually. So it's nowhere. But I think when we do these processes, it's when we pick up loopholes and faults so that we can strengthen these processes. And as we engage also like this, we are going forward and we're going to strengthen our research priorities in different areas. So it's better than doing nothing. Thank you.
Yes, I think for the Philippines, it's the same thing. I think this process of health research priority setting has helped to bring to fore the subnational concerns, since we start with a bottom-up approach. So I think one of our main successes is that we kind of drew attention away from our metropolitan centers. We were able to generate research support and interest from the researchers in the communities and universities that seldom had the opportunity to get funded or to get their interests on the table as well.
I would think about that question at several levels. And I would say it depends on what you think about as did it make a difference. For the institutions, if you think at the institutional level, I think the processes legitimize them because they are doing what they are mandated to do. And it's good for them to have at least something to say, we've done this. If we think about making a difference, like was the research funded? We heard from Google said only 28% of the list was funded. So if we are thinking about how many of those priorities were funded, 28%, and I think we heard repeatedly yesterday that many of the priorities are not funded depending on who has set the priorities. So if we are thinking about it in those terms, maybe it does make a difference for the 28%, but maybe not so much. If we are again going further, and I think we discussed this in our group, to say, do we believe health research priority setting has an impact, should have an impact on population health? Then I think I would toss that question back to the audience. Because that is also, it's another level of making a difference. And maybe that's what the goal should be. But are we getting there if we don't evaluate? One member in our group actually talked about the research that was funded during COVID, that only, I think, 1 or 2% of it got to actually having population impact. So I think there are several levels, and I think one could think about it in terms of the process, saying at the institutional level, did it make a change? Did it make a change in population health? That is more lower the scale that we may not be able to evaluate that. But that goes back to the issue of evaluation. If we don't evaluate priority setting, if we don't evaluate the impact it is having, and if we don't articulate what that impact should be, we will not know that we are making a difference.
Right, great. Okay, in keeping with Joseph's speech, I'm going to outsource the decision who to give the mic to Adrian and Rachel. And based on the criteria that if you could select somebody whom you think hasn't had the opportunity to speak so far, and we'll just do it first Rachel, then Adrian. So yeah, who's got the next mic?
Okay, I have it right now. Okay. I got it. I got lucky. Okay. So I just, and I'm speaking from my own experience from Pakistan, is that sometimes the governments also leave sort of like a vacuum in this area, and a lot of private actors, especially those from the academia, actually push for setting the health research priority. So what has been your experience, and this is directed to all three, did this feature private actors, non-government actors actually play a role in the governance structures of health research priority setting in your contexts? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. In my setting, the academia was part of the stakeholders. So they had a say as well in what research needs to be prioritized. So although they were not like given a very special or like a higher platform than anybody else, but they were there, they were invited. But I get your point that maybe we should give them a higher platform in the prioritizing of research and, you know, make use of them instead of just making them a part of the audience so that we can get much from them and guidance. Thank you.
So in our setting, our NGO is commissioned by the government to conduct these research priority setting exercises. I am not sure with the whole universe of other RPS exercises, but to my knowledge, there are notable private-led RPS exercises. There might be institutional, ones at the institutional level, but none so at the national level, the same level as the PNHRS.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you. I get lucky. Thank you very much. I have a question for each of you. I'll start with Gugu. A practical question. So you had quite a number of questions, research ideas, priorities that people suggested, about 1,000 or something, and then you finally distilled all that into, you know, a packet. I'm struggling to understand how you managed to do that from this 1,000 to those few, and what the potential ethical implications are. I tried to highlight that in my talk yesterday. Same thing we experienced in Ghana in terms of how the researchers would then have to make some decisions to prune and group and regroup questions, and whether that could potentially dampen some voices and in a way actually violate the beneficence principle, because then you are not really, you may end up with a list that probably didn't reflect what some people actually wanted. So I wanted to know your comments on how you went about that. The second question goes to Lydia. You talked about the processes and the impact, and I wondered whether you wanted to clarify whether it's the impact, the lack of evidence in evaluating the processes of doing research priority settings, or the impact of utilizing the priorities that we come up with. And I think you just talked a bit about it, but I wanted some clarity on that. And the last one goes to Joseph. You mentioned in Philippines, yes, you talked about some of your recommendations. You said there's a risk of outsourcing and giving contractors like your group to do this. But I wasn't sure if you could highlight what the real risk is, you know, and compare that to getting governments to do that. And your recommendation was that we should, you know, build government capacity to do some of these things. But I also thought that, you know, outsourcing and letting other people from a certain level look at things from an unbiased perspective may actually be useful. But maybe what we then need to do is to build the capacity of governments to have that oversight and to be able to understand the process so that they can query and ask questions about what is coming up. So I wanted your perspective on your recommendation that maybe outsourcing may not be a good idea. Thanks.
Try to be quick. Your question is actually asking about data analysis. So the data analysis, the most important thing is that every single one of those questions forms part of the data. Not even a single one is lost. So we do a two-stage analysis using a two-dimensional grid. So you first do qualitative analysis. Qualitative analysis when you code the question, each and every one of the questions into themes. A two-dimensional grid will give you two codes, a primary and a secondary code. For example, if the question is why do people fail to adhere to HIV treatment? So the first code will be HIV and the second code will be adherence. And then you do quantitative analysis when you've coded qualitatively, you quantify how many were the same, the same codes, percentage-wise. Then you have the questions, the research questions, which are research that was done, and then versus the research question, prioritized questions. Then for each you compare. In the prioritized questions, how many were those coded as such, and versus the research that was conducted. Then you compare, did it meet the priority questions or it didn't? Then you get the percentage of how many were met and how many were not met. I don't know if I've answered you correctly.
So about your question about whether we just we talk about impact and not the process, the framework actually goes beyond just those two. The framework has 5 domains. It talks about the prioritization context, because so many times priority setting doesn't happen the way we want because of the context. The process is perfect, everything is good, we are engaging the stakeholders and everything, but the context is just not conducive. So social, political, cultural context is important. The other domain that I didn't highlight because of time is the prerequisites. We believe that priority setting should be supported by a legitimate institution or organization with the capacity to set priorities. But in addition to that, they should have resources to set priorities and to implement priorities. Otherwise, you will not have an impact. Then the next step is the process. Actually, the big focus of the framework is on the process, where we integrated Norm Daniels' 4 criteria for a fair process, and then we included explicit criteria and evidence, which we talked about yesterday, that those are very when we are thinking about the process. And Norm Daniels' framework also emphasizes stakeholder engagement and wide stakeholder engagement. Then that is when we move to the impact and outcomes. So the framework goes through all those aspects. And one thing that we got a pushback on actually about it when we were validating it was that it's too broad and people don't know how to use it, it's too much. So, but we do talk about the process, we do talk about the inputs, we talk about the impact and that kind of thing. Thank you.
The question of, I guess, better, outsourcing to contractors and how our recommendations just mentioned to steer away from outsourcing. I think there is a good argument to be made for better technical oversight, that's true. But in our conception of this recommendation, we understand in the context of the Philippines, there are other RPS exercises to be done, not just at the national level. So at the institutional level, at the subnational levels. And it would be better and more efficient if the government would just take on these processes for themselves and not have to invite a contractor that might have to go through different procurement laws, different other hurdles about regulation. And if it were just government in this stewardship role at the helm of RPS, it would be much faster and efficient for public fund use.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. You've just talked yourself out of a national job.
We could help them acquire the skills, knowledge, skills, and transfer. It could be the next role we play.
Rachel, do we have anybody else? I think we have time for at least one more.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the presentations. I think Lydia is touching on a lot of this, but I just wanted to make a few comments around institutionalization of health research priority setting. And I suppose the same way we have been thinking about just priority setting for health over the last decade or so in terms of institutionalizing it and thinking about specific processes that should be followed, looking at examples like in Thailand, HITAP and health technology assessment processes that are followed in order to set priorities for health interventions. And I think the same can be applied to health research priority setting. The speakers are all illuminating that more institutionalization is required. And with that potentially comes legal requirements as well, not just these moral obligations on behalf of governments. And if we had these institutionalization or priority setting institutions within countries, then obviously it links to the evidence-based decision making and things that Joe was talking about yesterday around explicit criteria and measuring benefits and outcomes. And I guess the question comes back then, I mean, we could think about a process of institutionalization, what an institutionalized priority setting would look like, and kind of the methods that could be incorporated under there. And then it would be up to countries to develop their own context-specific frameworks, and we've seen examples. But the question comes back to the donors and the funders, and the influence that they play in this, and are they engaged in the process as stakeholders, or is there a different accountability that has to be put in place for the donors around the transparency around how they make these decisions? Because even if we institutionalize this at country level, like the example Lydia gave, the different frameworks were then used to suit the donors, really. So it kind of comes back to the donors, and how do we hold them accountable? Who holds them accountable, actually, at the end of the day? And how do we see that the evidence-based priority setting that happens in the countries is really not just responding to the donors, but the donors are more responding to that. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that reflection. I'm not sure, was there a question in there for anybody? It was just a comment, right. How they view, okay, great. So maybe we'll just take it in turn if anybody has any comments or responses to that observation.
I'm talking too much. I think maybe I will take this away.
Do you want to just say something quick? No, it's your session.
Actually, I may have a wrong concept, but I thought when I talked to NIMRI and the NRAs in Uganda and Zambia, that they actually have institutionalized priority setting. It's one of the mandates. It's one of the things they are supposed to do. And they are supposed to do it regularly, except sometimes they don't have the resources to do it. So they don't do it. So they are trying, and that is why in my presentation I emphasize that they should be supported to do what they should be doing. They should be supported. They need resources, they need capacity building, they need human resources, not only money. They need capacity strengthening. One thing that I heard repeatedly from the NHRAs was that we come in, and now I'm on the other side because they tell me, oh, you come in with all these frameworks, your fancy frameworks. You don't even tell us how they work. You just ask us for information. We give you information, you do the process, you give us a list, and you leave. And we cannot replicate what you did. So that is why, I'm just saying what you said, that once they've institutionalized priority setting as part of their activities, they need the capacity strengthening to carry out their mandate. But then the issue of donors, I don't want to repeat what I said. I think there is a responsibility for the NHRAs to involve the donors in their prioritization process. The question of who holds donors accountable, I have no response. But I was told for some of the organizations, I will not mention them because of confidentiality, that I talked to, one of them told me, we are a foundation, it's someone's money, it's an individual's money whom I will not mention, so we do what he likes. Okay? That was one organization. Then the other organization told me, we are a government organization, this is taxpayers' money, we do what our taxpayers want. So there is a tension that much as we blame the donors, they are also accountable to they get money from somewhere. Money is not coming from wherever. I'm in Canada, I'm paying taxes, so I also want to know where my tax money is going. So the funding agencies are accountable to their governments as well. They are accountable to their public, the taxpayer as well. So much as when we sit on this side and we are talking about the role of donors and their transparency and that kind of thing, we should also know that they also have to be accountable to the people who are giving them the money. And they also have to respond to the needs of those people. So I think I don't have a solution and an answer, but I just want to kind of us to have a balanced perspective of this, that it's not only the low-income countries that hold the donors accountable, they are also held accountable by the people who are giving them the money, and those people have a say and should have a say in how their money is used.
Yeah, thanks, Lydia. I think that's really helpful, and I think it would really be helpful, and she said, looking meaningfully at Joe, who's not even looking back, to, it'd be really great to have an exercise and actually really mapping out all the different players, because it's so nuanced, as we've learned over the last 2 days. You have donor organizations that are funded by the states, and their accountability and responsibility lines are going to be quite different from independent donors, or very specific, maybe disease-specific donor organizations, versus what are the responsibilities and roles of states? Are they responsible to the people? And what are the intersections between where donors come into states? Do they then become responsible to the states, or do they remain responsible to their own governments, and how we sort of map these lines? And I think that would... Do you want to say something? Yeah, cool. I don't have a mic. Adrian.
Thanks. Since I've been called out for not looking at Sharon while she is speaking, I'll say something. Just, first of all, I agree, it'd be great to have a map of this, and I'm hoping that's something that we can do, looking at Catherine here. The other is, it is also, I think, helpful to distinguish between who different entities who do priority setting or support research are accountable to. So, that the CIHR is accountable to the Canadian government and therefore to the taxpayer. That's true. But we shouldn't assume that who they perceive themselves to be accountable to is equivalent to who they are ethically obliged to take account of, right? So I think, speaking of the US NIH now, the NIH will say we're accountable to the US taxpayer, right? But a lot of people within NIH will think, no, we care about people globally, and we want to support global research. And I think that captures an important distinction between who you are maybe legally or politically accountable to, and who you ought to be thinking about.
Absolutely. So I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I really also am aware of what Barbara was talking about, and how hard the people working in IN and NIH do to try and channel money into global health work, even though legally their remit is actually to be answerable entirely to Congress. So what's legally required is, tragically, she says as a lawyer, not always what is ethically required. So I'd like to thank the three speakers for a wonderful presentation, and thank you, everybody.